morning. Welcome to today's Halacha class. Today's class is going to be about the fundamentals of adoption in Jewish law. And we don't really find a whole lot of examples of adoption in Jewish law because the actual legal term as we use it here in the United States means that you are the presumptive parent. The courts will go ahead and assign all legal guardianship to the adoptive parent. So there is a legal process in secular law to abrogate the relationship between the biological parents and give those rights specifically to the adoptive parents. This right is never broken in Halacha. So that is something really important to distinguish. So that's something that's going to be a theme in learning about adoption a little bit. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the issues surrounding adoption itself, about the lineage. This is sort of a fundamentals. We're not going to cover all of the issues, but we're going to cover basically, that there's certain things to worry about, and the fundamentals of where this is a concern is how we're going to approach it. And we're going to take a look at some of the sort of basic obligations and some of the concerns that come up through the course of adoption. So number one, adopting a Jewish child is what we're going to start with. So the most obvious case of someone adopting a child. Now, again, there are cases like, in the Torah it talks about that, if we teach somebody Torah, it's like the children are yours, etc. We're not going to divert ourselves with sort of the agadata. We're going to deal with sort of the strict legal fundamentals here. So the earliest case we have of somebody raising someone else's child is there's this guy Mordechai in the Megillah, and he has a niece. He's named Hadassah, and he basically takes care of her. So the pasuk says, "Vayhi omein es Hadassah," and so it was that he was the omein. He was the caretaker. He was the parent figure. And omein either comes from the word for aim as a mother, or omein as in a specialist. Vayhi omein es Hadassah hi Esther bas Dodo. Okay. His uncle's daughter, okay, ki ein la am ve'em, for her she had no parents, v'ha na'ara yifas Torah yifas ma'eh, u'v'mosa via ve'ema lekcha Mordechai lo levas, and Mordechai basically took her in as his own. So just to kind of explain this a little bit more, so it says. So it says in the translation, for example, in the Aramaic, that he basically was hiding her in his house, okay, to keep her away from. That's why she was called Esther. He's trying to hide her from Achashverosh, because he was looking. Achashverosh wanted to take all the maidens in the whole town, so he was trying. That's why she was called Esther. But really, her name was Hadassah. Okay, and when the parents died away, he was the only one left. So he called her his daughter. So even though she wasn't his daughter, that's what he called her. So it's an interesting thought process. So even, for example, the Ibn Ezra, for example, says that when it says he called her daughter, he says, so he basically was taking care of her. He calls her a sochen. He calls him, a sochen for her. A sochen is also used by David HaMelech as sochenet, is a caretaker or manager, something like a health manager. So that someone who needs a person to take care of them, that is that is what they are doing, is taking the place of care. So why is this important? Why is this interesting at all? So the Gemara in Sanhedrin, it basically says the following. This is Gemara in Sanhedrin. This is on Daf Yud Testament Beis, page 19b, and it basically says that one who raises the children of others is one who raises the child is as if they gave birth to the child. Okay, and so when do we find that? So the primordial case for that is Naomi, right? It said, so you know, so it says towards the end of this book of Ruth that a child was born to Naomi. Okay, so some people say because Boaz passed away. The Midrash says, I think this Gemara says that she did most of the raising. Naomi did most of the raising, and so that's considered a big mitzvah. So the Gemara calls that a mitzvah, but nowhere in Halacha, other than saying that it's a big mitzvah, do we say that that adoption is something real. So the code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, it's actually quite quiet about the adoption process, and they are called hamagatlo or chorgo, someone who attaches himself or sticks around the house. So in one place, in the Gemara in Even HaEzer, for example, in chapter 15:11, they talk about a person who has a stepchild growing up in the house, and the Gemara goes back and forth debating about whether or not those children are considered to be prohibited to each other or not, and the Gemara concludes that there is no. Gemara wants to know if there's like if the children who were stepchildren who grew up and got married, legally speaking, are they violating any incest laws? And the Gemara concludes that they don't, but the question is there a rabbinic prohibition or is there not? So the Gemara concludes that there was no need, because there would be no need because people would know that the child was adopted. And however, in the Sefer Hasidim and also in other later Achronim, especially in the Ashkenazi world, they were very clear about there being a custom to develop that stepchildren don't marry each other. But by Torah law, basically the transfer of the child, there's no legal disconnect, unlike law at the time, which stands in huge contrast to Roman law. The reason why this is important to contrast to Roman law is the following. One more point about sort of fundamental here, and I want to talk about this. So the Ramah says in Kosher Mishpat, it's 42:19, someone who raises an orphan in their home and calls them my son in the contract, okay, or someone who was orphaned and he wrote my father or my mother, it is not considered a falsified contract. It is kosher since they raised him, okay? And a little footnote over there from the Degel Mervava says, even, and the Degel Mervava is a work of little notes from Rav Yaakov Endin, even if he's not an orphan, he still writes my father and mother. So you can get that written into the document, and it's not considered a false document. So even though in Halacha we don't recognize a legal transfer of rights to these parents, what we do have is we do have some recognition and some setup to basically say that there is something to be said for being raised in the household. So let's gonna look at this aspect of it in terms of what the issues were. So during Roman times, Romans basically decided that the way they were gonna deal with the issue of children that were sort of basically left, okay, babies in baskets on doorsteps, okay. So the way the modern version of that, but the way they dealt with orphans is to basically terminate the rights of the parents and then transfer the rights of the parent to the other child. And in fact, this Roman law stayed in effect, I think, even into the United States until I think almost the 1970s. So I'm not an expert on law, but there was if you look at some of the laws themselves, and in many of the laws, especially from British common law to come to today, children were considered a transferable or property of the father and were transferable. So in a sense, someone couldn't go ahead and give the child away as long as there was a father. There were exceptions to that. For example, in American law, if the parents weren't married, that did not apply in Roman law. Marriage was not absolutely required. The parents were still expected to take care of the child, and if they did not take care of the child, um, there is a term that we still use nowadays as well, that the court takes the place of the parent for assigning responsibility for the child, and this legal precept is still in effect even into modern law today. The court can basically sever your parental rights in American law and transfer it to somebody else. But in Halacha, that never happens. You are always beholden to your parents in some form or other. You have the obligation to honor them, you have an obligation to take care of you, etc., etc., etc. And there's a whole bunch of things in there. So then the question just becomes, okay, so what what is adoption in Halacha? So let's establish a few things. If you left the child out exposed, which is what the Roman governments were dealing with, you exposed the child. The Halacha was basically to assume that there must be an issue with the lineage of the child. The child was exposed to the elements, and they were called one of two things, either a Sufi or Shtatuki. So if it was a Sufi, it was a child that was collected from the public area. So the child was collected from the public area, and the parents don't want to be discovered. It was assumed that if this were mostly a Jewish area, the child was Jewish, and therefore you had an obligation to take care of the child, and the community would then have responsibility to take care of the child, because under Jewish law we have to take care of every Jewish soul. Whereas if it was a mostly non-Jewish city, you could go ahead and present the child to the Roman governor and then say, hey, this may be a non-Jewish child. So if the parents are non-discoverable. However, when you collect a child from the market and it's in a place where it's mostly a Jewish city, then you have to assume the child might not be of a good lineage, because someone wouldn't just go ahead and not care for the welfare of the child unless they are embarrassed by the circumstances under which the child was conceived. So the child was conceived because of some form of some type of an affair or incest, something like that, which would make it difficult for that child to go ahead and live in society, and having the parents raise the child together would also be an embarrassment. So therefore, the child was taken care of, and the child was cared for by the community, but the child was not permitted to marry into the community because of a doubt as to whether or not the child had a proper lineage. However, that was only rabbinic in origin. Why it was only rabbinic in origin? Class for another time. The non-Jewish children would go ahead and be presented to the Roman government for them to do with as they please. Now, in cases like this, when you had these abandoned children that were raised as orphans and abandoned, it did apply for other situations to be applied. This application of who's the majority would be applied to them for the rest of their lives. Were they allowed to apply to the Jewish community for a charity? There's also pikuach nefesh, saving a life on Shabbos. If they're not Jewish, you can't go ahead and set aside the whole Sabbath for them, because you have to restrict what you do, because you only set aside the Sabbath for Sabbath observers. And there's also a multitude. If you're in a place like that where there's lots of non-Jews, they can also take care of. They can set up systems for themselves, mostly because in most of the Jewish world we for centuries had autonomous groups taking care of ourselves. And even nowadays it feels like we need to have our own autonomous groups, because you can't rely on your non-Jewish neighbors to respect your right to life, liberty, and property. So while that doesn't really, it's not as bad as it was in Europe. I digress. The point being that a point in adoption means that the child is still going to have a number of rights and responsibilities emptied onto the community as a result of being left to be taken care of. So that's the Sufi case. In the case of a Shtatuki is where the child has one parent, usually the mother, and when they talk about the father, they say you shtuk. Shlock means to be quiet. They quiet them about the child's parent. So there was one parent taking care of them, and we know that we can assume the child is a Jewish child. However, the child, because they won't talk about the father, one could go ahead and make assumptions that the child is unfit to marry somebody else in the Jewish community. Again, a rabbinic enactment. Now, does that mean that's the whole story? That's the full story? Not necessarily, because again, that was centuries ago. So things and times have changed, and the question is, how do we handle these different issues, and how does it develop? So, but the fundamentals are the following: that the child remains directly connected to the original parents, and that their status, their lineage status, if it's unknown, affects their ability to sort of completely integrate into the Jewish community. So how does that impact modern adoption practices? The idea of modern adoption sort of follows the Roman way of looking at things, which is, this is now your kid. Here you go, have a baby. It's now yours, right? And also the whole thing about don't tell them who the parents are, and don't do this, and that. We seal it with that, with it. So post-Holocaust, a lot of these questions became much more important because you had a lot of these orphan children coming out of Europe who didn't have parents. And there was a lot of questions for some of these Jewish orphanage homes about the lineage of these children. So famously, they asked two big poskim about adoption in general. They asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, they asked Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, Zichronam Livracha, both of whom should be remembered for all the good they did to the world in the turn of the 20th century, and all of their commitments in the Talmudim they raised up for all those years, because they set a few guidelines for adoption. Now, this is in stark contrast to what I would call the Haredi approach, the right wing, the part that they didn't get involved in the hospitals, they didn't get involved in the institutions, they weren't on the ground dealing with these issues, and so we'll talk about them in a second. So what a number of issues that sort of pop up in adoption cases is the ability to go ahead and make decisions for the children, having them live in the home comfortably, and having them basically showing them the same affection you would show all the other children that were in the home. Because if they're not your child, then you couldn't, if they're of the opposite gender, a certain age, you shouldn't be hugging and kissing them because that's not appropriate. You shouldn't be home alone with them because yichud is an issue. And providing for them at an equal amount as the other children is a difficulty. And also you're going to insist on knowing who the parents were, so that way when you want to go ahead and marry them off, that you can do it. You could do that. So these things are all standing in stark contrast to the secular view of these things. So Rav Moshe and Rav Eliezer Waldenberg basically say the adopted child becomes yours almost completely. You don't have to worry about any of these things. You don't have to worry about staying at home alone with them because there's no problem. You're going to treat them like a biological parent. The issues were sociological, and the reason why the rabbis made the rules like yichud and other things were for sociological reasons. And so then, sociologically, if your whole experience of the person is as if they were your biological parent, then there's no reason to extend these prohibitions to you. It just makes your life more difficult for no reason. And that was basically their argument. So when you adopted children, for Eliezer Waldenberg was the most clear in his permission for the adoption proceedings done in the land of Israel, and the state of Israel, and to allow adopted children to basically take on all the other standards and rights of a parent, and even means to be called up with the Torah by their adopted parent's name. So that's something that not even the most right-wing person would object to. It just becomes a question of how do you write their name in the get later on, and if they were in a kasuba, how would you write them? So those are other issues. Writing how you should write it in documents. But we already saw that it's not a problem if they write it in a document as long as they raise them. It's not an issue. It's not considered something that is mezuyah mitoicha, where it's actually been forged. So we're not trying to forge a document. They really meant it when they said, "This is my father, this is my mother," when they write it in a document. So that's the sort of the I would call it sort of the general practice rule for adoption. That's for Jewish children. So you have to know the lineage. You have to do this and that. So the first line of kind of objected to this around that time period. There was actually a big rally cry from all people. Rav Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, was the first one who really made a big deal and publicized that that adopted children should not be treated the same as the biological children. They made a big deal about this, and they got a large number of other rabbis in and around the Hasidic world to sort of write really long responsa and to take this approach. And it also the same question went to Israel as well, to some of the Gedolim in Israel, like the Chazon Ish. And so Rabbi Shaya Karelitz was also very stringent to say, no, you can't treat them like a biological child. You have to treat them like a stranger in your home. You're just doing them a favor by raising them. There's no rights changing. There's no psychological changing. These are things that are made up. This is not in the Torah law itself. And strangely enough, despite having been very influential in the writing of a number of works on medical ethics for Rabbi Abraham and Abraham in the Nishmas Abraham, a work that contains a large amount of writings quoting Rav Waldenberg for his knowledge in medicine. He challenges this permissive status of Rav Waldenberg and of Rav Moshe, saying that it doesn't seem to be consistent with the Halacha. And instead he says that I asked other poskim in Israel. I asked Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and I asked Rav Elyashiv, which was at the time both of them were alive when he asked them the question, obviously. And he asked them. They both agreed with him in some sense that one should not be treating an adopted child exactly like a biological one. That there is some boundaries there because they are adopted. So, however, everyone would agree that you could go ahead and have your name take on their name. So if you want to write it in a document and so on, like in the kasuba or other legal documents, you say that I'm so and so, the son of so and so. You have to say that he raised you. Some people require you that if you were raised by adopted parents, you have to write Hamagadloi, who raised him. Or Humagadli, right? Or who raised me. But usually Magadloi, who raised him, because the documents are generally written in the third person and not in the first person. So the leniency is rejected by a large number of people, and some posters were even placed some 10 years ago around Jerusalem talking about adoption and what the rules should be and so on and so forth. So it's really interesting discussion about that. So that's for a Jewish child. If you adopt a non-Jewish child, it's a whole different game over there. Because of the non-Jewish child, there is an idea that you can have a full transfer of rights, and also that the court can go ahead, if the parents would go ahead and give up rights to the child, the court go ahead and convert the child to be Jewish. Because it's a big merit that they could go ahead and be raised that way. So, this is a very interesting issue, because some people feel that the only way that you can convert a non-Jewish child is if one of the parents consents. But a number of people disagree with that, and they say that even though it sounds that way, so it sounds like a non-Jewish parent could go ahead and would have to go ahead and give permission to the court to do that. There seems to be that if the non-Jewish parent has gone ahead and transferred their rights, they have the ability to do that. They don't have the same obligations as the Torah puts on people, and so they can go ahead and transfer those rights, and then therefore the court go ahead and bring some merit to it. And then the other questions about that we just brought up too, about since they're not biologically related, it would still be in effect. But you would have all of the requirements of raising them like someone who takes care of any other minor. So again, there is an obligation to take care of the child and all those other things. And also they can take on your name since you've raised them, but those are things that are sort of meta, extra halachic. There's no explicit requirement, rabbinic or otherwise, to go ahead and continue these things. So it's really just a good thing to do, a nice thing, an appropriate thing to do. So just kind of wrap up sort of fundamentals here of adoption. We learned that that with Jewish children there is no transfer of rights away from the biological parents. The biological parents always remain the parents, and therefore we need to know who they are and what they lived and what their story was, because there are rabbinic enactments in place to basically restrict the integration of children that have been adopted, where we don't know who the parents are. So therefore, you have to be aware and be conscious of their lineage and have that information be shared. You also have to take care to focus on raising the child in your home and to give them equal access to many other things that other children get, and that's when they're considered like your own child. It's a big mitzvah, the Gemara says. So like Gemara from Sanhedrin. And we also find that there is a big dispute amongst many big poskim about whether some of the rules of yichud and the dia, whether they should be lifted or whether they are still enforced. And these are sort of fundamental issues within that. And we also talked about how they can go ahead and use the name of the adopted parents who raised you. It's not a problem to use it for the Torah. They call it the Torah that way, to use it in a document, legal document like a ksuba or a get. To go ahead and use the name of the parent that raised you. These are all appropriate things. We did talk about the difference in the legal proceedings in America versus Jewish law that can create some friction, but overall there's an expectation to, just like in American law, take care of the child as if it was one's own child, with just some important legal ramifications, but no real practical legal differences. So those are the fundamentals of adoption and halacha. So as we learn, it's still a big mitzvah to do it. It's one who does it is as if they have given birth to the child. As we saw in the case of Naomi, it's considered your child. You invest in the raising the child. It's a big mitzvah, so much so that it's as if you yourself brought the child into existence. It's a part of, you want to bring children into the world. The mitzvah is also to raise them as well, raise them in Torah, and to bring them to the chuppah and to Ma'asim Tovim. So it's important to do all the right things that they do. They grow to be good and well fulfilled Jews can integrate properly into the Jewish people. Everyone have a wonderful day. We'll talk to you soon.